All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Moskowitz with the Citizens Utility Board. I'm the current executive director. I'm joined by Marty Cohen. We're having some technical difficulties. Marty, are you there, Marty?
I'm here. Yes, we're having a few difficulties.
Excellent.
We didn't used to have these back in the day because there was no technology.
Yeah, no, it's a moving target, but we've got it together. I'm really happy to have you here, Marty. It's always a pleasure to chat with you about CUB, and I feel like an old timer around CUB because I've been there since 2000. But you started at the organization in 1985, not long after CUB was created, and then you worked for a bit, and then eventually you became executive director, where you stayed until 2005, and there's a whole story about that. But I'm interested in kind of what got you into the work and what CUB was like when you first joined the group.
Well, when I started at CUB, which was the first of 85, I believe there were 4 staff people in the organization, led by Sue Stewart, first executive director. CUB had been founded in the spring of 84, and it was sort of chartered by the state legislature. It was an act of the General Assembly that put CUB in business in response to rate hikes and consumer anger, familiar things that never seem to go away. And the utilities and the governor at the time, Governor Thompson, decided that the best option would be to have some consumer advocacy, which most other states had, but Illinois did not at the time. So they started CUB and put us on the map. And it was a fledgling organization, 3 or 4 staff people with no money to speak of, but the ability to raise money by appealing directly to consumers. At that time, it was through state of Illinois. It was through utility bills. All utility bills originally had a CUB mailer. It said on it, if you're angry about this utility bill, donate $5 and join CUB, and you can fight back. That was pretty effective. And within 6 months, we had, I believe, something like 100,000 members around the state. It grew to be several times that over time, and that gave us the resources and the sort of the backing that we needed, the legitimacy among customers to become an effective advocate, mostly before the Illinois Commerce Commission. So I started in 85. The group started in the spring of 84. And I was hired as a temp initially because I had some business background a little bit and administrative background. And so somebody got sick and they were looking for somebody to take over the administrative duties for a couple of weeks. Well, the couple of weeks ended up to be a couple of months, and then pretty soon it ended up to be a lot longer than that, almost more than 20 years, actually, by the time I left. So I did not aspire to become a consumer advocate, but I'd heard about CUB and certainly seemed right up my alley. I was doing political work at the time, various sorts. I worked for Harold Washington when he was elected mayor in 83, or before he was elected mayor. I worked on his campaign, and I worked for Senator Paul Simon before he was elected to the United States Senate in 84. And they were great advocates, and I wanted to be an advocate as well. And CUB seemed like a pretty good place to start.
Yeah. It's funny how many people who work at CUB end up sticking around. Like you, I was hired, wasn't setting out to be a utility consumer advocate, had never even heard of the organization when I applied to work for CUB. And the rest is history. Since then, I've done a lot of different jobs here, and I think there's something about the work. It's never changing. or is always changing and never ending, I guess. I think when
Yeah.
I remember when I first sat down with you for my interview, when I first got hired, we were talking about what happens if you're too effective and you essentially put yourself out of business. And I realize that that's never, unfortunately, perhaps that's never going to happen. There's always something going on. And
Well, the system is set up to make that consumer advocacy a requirement for a well-functioning regulatory system. Without advocates on the customer side, it can't be done, and they'll be in trouble. So, but it takes expertise, lots of it. It takes a long time to develop that, because there's so many issues and so many industries, and of course, on the other side, the utilities have virtually unlimited resources and lots of expertise, and the regulators are kind of in the middle, and they're experts as well, or they're supposed to be. So competent consumer advocacy takes a lot of time to learn it and be good at it. And CUB's been doing it for 40 years and has developed a pretty good reputation, I'd say, for nationally, one of the best consumer advocacy groups in the country.
I agree. I think so too. It's interesting, and I know anybody who's seen me on one of these Facebook Lives with Collada, my predecessor as executive director, or anybody else, I always talk about how much the work has changed over the years. When I first started, the biggest thing I was working on as one of the consumer rights counselors picking up the phone was landline telephone service and spiraling phone bills. And, now, like so many people I interact with in the field now have never even owned a landline telephone, and chuckle in a superior way when I tell them that I still have all the space in my brain taken up by all this knowledge of ILEX and CLEX and Intralata and all that good stuff. I wish I could clear that out. So I'm curious about what were the now, of course, the clean energy transition is a big issue, making sure that that's done affordably, making sure that benefits are actually shared with residential utility customers. It's a whole can of worms there, and it's been really fun to be in that space. What were the biggest kind of issues that y'all were working on in the 80s, say, in the early days of CUB?
The biggest issues had to do with electricity and the what was the rate basing of nuclear power plants. Back in those days, utility companies were fully vertically integrated. That means that a company like ComEd owned everything from the power plants that generated the energy to the wires that transmitted them, everything right up until the meter at your house, and only things on your side of the meter were yours. Everything else was a monopoly of the utility company. There was no competition, and they owned everything. So it was fully regulated, a system that was invented, more than 100 years ago. And why do we need regulation at all? Because utilities are what they call natural monopolies. And so you have to regulate them. Otherwise, they could simply charge whatever they want. And you wouldn't want to have competing utility companies in the multiple sets of wires running down the alleys. Would be very, economically inefficient, and it would raise the costs. So the idea still is that you have, where monopolies exist, you have to regulate them. And if you do it well, everybody can benefit. You can have good, high quality service at the lowest possible prices, and the utilities can still make a profit. Well, back in the 1970s, starting in the 60s, ComEd was authorized to start building nuclear power plants, which were thought to be, the wave of the future. And in fact, they were. They were going to be so cheap over time because the nuclear fuel was going to be so inexpensive, and the plants were going to last many, many decades. So the costs were really upfront costs, capital costs to build them. Well, it turns out the capital costs to build them were many multiples of what had been forecast. The plants were built, and they were perfectly good plants in most cases, but they often came in at 8 or 10 times over the initial budget. They were very expensive. And so the battles we were fighting in the mid 80s, the central battles were over how much should customers have to pay for these plants, because it wasn't the consumer's fault that they had been over budget. And were they really needed was another question, because it turns out that the growth in energy consumption and demand was not nearly as much as had been forecast when they were starting to build these plants. And of course, nuclear plants take so long to build that they had to forecast out a decade, and they were wrong. The demand for power didn't quite ever match what they had said it would. And so you had these very expensive plants, which really weren't needed. So the costs had to be spread out among fewer kilowatt hours of energy production, or energy consumption. And the result was a series of really big rate hikes as these nuclear plants were rate-based. And then in 1985, the legislature rewrote the Public Utilities Act. That was the first big battle I was involved in over what the new Public Utilities Act would say. And it did, I won't go into the details, but it did put the utility companies at some risk for cost overruns and, shall we say, inaccurate forecasts and such. Not a lot of risk, but some. And so there was a series of big rate hikes starting in the 70s. And it turns out the nuclear power was not too cheap to meter. It was very expensive. And there were double-digit rate hikes for several years in a row in the early 80s. That caused CUB to be founded because people were so angry about it, and the legislature thought something needed to be done. And then there was a series of cases, and CUB participated in those, as did some other parties. And then there was a series of court victories based on the new legislation in 1985 that CUB and others on the consumer side, we won some court victories that required the utilities to, ComEd and what became Ameren to, ease off on the rate hikes, shall we say. In fact, to, in some cases, even lower the rates temporarily. So CUB did pretty well in the courts and even in the legislature, and eventually at the Commerce Commission, the regulatory agency as well, beginning in the mid 80s.
It's interesting. I mean, I knew about the cost overrun aspect of the nukes, and I knew that anger over those spiraling costs and the kind of inefficient operation, I think, of those spurred the creation of CUB. I didn't know about the forecasting piece. I didn't realize that part of how the justification for the construction of these nukes was the, overestimates of how much more demand for power there was going to be. That's an interesting piece. But I think it's so funny because it's a different setting for kind of the same issues that we're still facing, which is something I think a lot of people don't realize, is that the traditional regulated investor-owned utility business model is that they make profits off of what they spend on capital, off their capital spending. So they have an incentive to build a bunch of stuff. And, that's why you end up in situations like that with the nukes. And that's why we're, for example, in a situation like we are with some gas utilities now, is that they've just been, spending hand over fist as a way to make money. And that's still kind of what we're battling over here. And it's just, I think the typical consumer, and I definitely didn't know this when I started CUB, didn't understand that is kind of the utility business model. And again, like you said, I think that's why you're always like, the utilities are acting in a way that makes sense for what they're doing, right? But that's why you need these checks on their power in the form of a CUB and other advocates.
Well, the regulatory process is supposed to have the optimal outcome, because you've got the utilities on one side, which, and as you say, they have a great incentive to invest more. Well, investing is good. We want them to invest in the right things, that will benefit their customers. And it's up to regulators to make sure that they don't invest too much and that they do invest in the right things and that they're held accountable for their decisions and their actions. And the customers are always the ones for whose benefit the utility is working. And when you have good regulators, it can work pretty well. And I think today, jumping forward a couple of decades, the Commerce Commission is a far cry from what it was back in the early 80s. Not to put too blunt a point on it, but the commission was kind of in the tank back then. At least it was perceived to be. They thought they could do nothing about the fact that there had been these approvals, preliminary approvals to build all these nuclear plants, for example, and sort of gold plate the whole system, and that they had no choice but to pass on these costs to customers in the form of quickly rising rates. That was one way to frame it, and that's the way they saw it. On the other side, we thought that they were simply, shall we say, too friendly with the utility companies. And it ended up in 1986 where there was an agreement, a negotiated agreement between ComEd and some other utilities and the Commerce Commission. Mostly this was the ComEd case that raised rates without an evidentiary record, without a legal process to identify what the rate should be based on the facts. They simply, there was a case, but then it was settled. And before the Illinois Commerce Commission, a case is a trial, and the record of evidence has to be what supports the outcome. Well, that wasn't entirely clear in 1986, and there was a deal done, straight up deal, without the evidence to back it up as to what the rates should be. So they said it was going to be a rate hike of, I think it was only like 12% or something like that at the time. And they said it was going to be the last rate hike forever. Which of course, come on. Right. Whatever they said at the time, CUB and others went to court and fought it. And turns out the courts ruled that the Commerce Commission cannot simply do a deal with utility companies to set the rates at a level that they've agreed to. They have to have a record of evidence to support it. And so that rate hike was thrown out. And there were a series of rate hikes thrown out that is sent back to the commission for reconsideration over a period of years. ComEd's financial statements were full of footnotes because they were collecting so much money subject to refund should they lose in final court proceedings for a good number of years. This was on their books. And Wall Street was not happy that they had all these contingencies, that they might have to give back billions of dollars. So finally in 1993, right about the time that I started as executive director, there was a settlement, a legal settlement, not at the Commerce Commission, but in the court cases. I think there were 6 court cases with ComEd that were settled. And the result was a $1.3 billion refund to consumers and a big rate cut. Essentially, electricity went on sale for 25% off for more than a year in 1993 and 94. Wow. And that was sort of the end of all that litigation over the nuclear plants. There was one more rate case in 1995. And then we moved on to restructuring the industry in 1997, which is a whole nother subject. But that been a lot of changes in the, especially on the energy side. Well, on the telephone side as well. The telephone mostly because of new technology that supplanted what the old phone network. On the electric side, it was new financial and regulatory and institutional structures that came into play as the technology allowed for competition in generation.
I want to ask you about that. Yeah, I want to ask you about regulation, or deregulation, or as we like to say, restructuring. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Of the electric system in Illinois. That was at a time when we were seeing those activities happen in a lot of states, not all states. And I think maybe some of what happened in California later might have caused some states to kind of hit the brakes on that. And so we still have many states in the country who are still vertically integrated, where you have the distribution utility still owns the generation. And then we have states that are deregulated or restructured, like Illinois, where ComEd doesn't own the nukes anymore. And Illinois is weird because we are split between two regional transmission organizations, which basically run the generation markets.
Mm-hmm.
The Ameren territory, central and southern Illinois, is in MISO, which is predominantly vertically integrated states. And then northern Illinois, ComEd territory, is in PJM, which is mostly restructured states. And so we've been moving more as CUB into kind of that regional transmission space to make sure that the decisions made there don't mess with what we're trying to accomplish here in Illinois. But I've never really heard much of the story about the deregulation process in Illinois. And I don't know much about the drivers for that. I've always assumed that was something that utilities came to Springfield and started talking about how this was going to be a great thing. I'm just like, how did you first hear about this proposal, and how did you guys get involved? I've never heard any of the background on all that.
Yeah, that's a very long story.
Okay.
But the movement toward what some people call deregulation, and what I would rather call restructuring, because it's still regulated, but in a very different way. The idea was that technology was moving in such a way that there was no reason to have this completely vertically integrated monopoly. Certain things are indeed forever a monopoly, like the wires running down the streets and the substations, and the whole grid is a monopoly. Now there is some competition or non-monopoly aspects at the transmission level, but we won't get into that. The distribution side is a monopoly, and it probably needs to be for a lot of reasons. But the generation of electricity, why can't there be a lot of independent generators who compete against each other, or who can sell it to you at the lowest price, who can be the most efficient producer, like we do in every other industry? Well, it's hard to do it in electricity. The barriers to entry are formidable. The capital needed to build a power plant is huge. But there really can be a market, and there used to be a small market, but only sort of in between utility company territories they would trade electricity. But eventually it became, partially due to improvements in technology and computers, for example, that would allow instantaneous transactions, and evolution of the transmission technology as well. So it became obvious eventually that you could have competition between generators. And that competition, the idea in our system is that competition is a good thing, because it means that producers get more efficient and costs go down, and eventually that benefits everybody. So that was the idea behind restructuring. Let's make the generators competitive, and keep the monopoly in the utility, but only the monopoly functions in the utility. Well, what's not a monopoly function? One of them, of course, as we've been saying, is the generation of electricity. You can have competition between power plants if it's well regulated at the federal or regional level. But you can also have competition between sellers of electricity. That is, at the retail level, buying from different providers instead of only buying from the utility. The idea was you could buy from any range of unregulated providers to get your energy. Well, that has turned out not to be such a good thing for consumers, because people don't understand how to shop for energy, and they're easily taken. And the unregulated providers they find they can manipulate consumers and get away with, quite a bit that utilities cannot. So I think the retail competition of energy for residential customers has been largely a failure, but the retail competition for the more sophisticated, larger customers has been pretty successful in many ways. The wholesale competition between generators has been pretty successful as well, very successful, and has brought down costs and prices. Now, the problem with the competitive market is when the commodity is scarce, the price can skyrocket. And so we have to be very careful about that. And there are times right now when the price goes way up and then comes back down. But if we have a sustained period of very high demand for electricity, the prices can go up and stay up in a competitive market. So we need to have good regulation and plenty of capacity to have an effectively competitive price constraining, as they say, market.
Yeah, no, and there's a lot in there, and it's true. Like when we're talking about competition in energy markets, you have to figure out what we're talking about, right? Because yeah, obviously I spent way too much of my life for the past 10 years helping people, individuals with residential utility accounts who are overpaying because they signed up with an alternative supplier for their home. But overall, the markets have generally been good, especially for consumers in Illinois. I've always wondered, I mean, again, this is something that I've always wondered, but I've never actually gotten an answer. I have my own theories, but about the fact that Commonwealth Edison is a part of PJM and not a part of MISO.
Yes.
I have theories, but if you look at the PJM map, you see a blob of northern Illinois, and then this teeny tiny little tunnel across Indiana, and then the rest of it is kind of
right. Well, what you're talking about are the RTOs. There are seven regional transmission organizations around the country, which are the reliability. They really were set up a long time ago for reliability purposes, because utilities are state regulated, but the lines are interstate and the generation is interstate, and it's a very complex web of a system, the largest machine ever built, of course, but also complex oversight and regulation. So these seven separate regional organizations, which are largely for maintaining reliability, they also, however, operate markets. At least they do in the last 25 years. They operate markets in which energy is traded, bought and sold by the wholesale. It is at the wholesale level by the generators themselves and those who buy and sell their energy. It's really complicated, and it's really hard to oversee effectively. That's done at the federal level and at the regional level, not at the state level. So it's a tricky business, and state law in Illinois allows utility companies to become a member of whatever market they want to. And it's their choice. So ComEd chose to become a member of the market, which PJM, which is mostly on the East Coast. And as you say, there's a little finger that goes through Ohio, Indiana to get to the ComEd. What is the Exelon? Now it's the Exelon generation units that used to be ComEd's, and is no longer, ComEd is no longer affiliated with the nuclear plants at all, and operates strictly as a regulated public utility. And that's a much better way to have it than it used to be, where where the ComEd was part of a bigger company that also owned the nuclear plants, so and other plants. So it was a very odd structure. You would never design it that way, but for sort of political and business evolutionary reasons, it was set up and allowed to continue for a long time under a structure in which Exelon owned the largest buyer of energy, ComEd, and they also owned the largest seller of energy.
Right. To what extent is this true competition? right?
Right. But
Yeah.
well, to the extent that there were others in the market and that there was effective regulation, you could have competition, and there was competition.
Hmm.
There was strict rules to prohibit, ComEd and the generation side of Exelon from communicating with each other, or, fixing prices or colluding in any way. And it was subject to lots of oversight, and corporate firewalls and such, but it was not the best structure for an industry. And eventually, Exelon decided to break itself up.
Hmm.
It was done voluntarily, because it was simply the contradictions of being the biggest buyer and the biggest seller, and being different arms of the same company, was not good for their standing well, on Wall Street, shall we say.
Hmm.
So they broke up several years ago and became two different separate companies. So ComEd now is only strictly a distribution company, and they make money on selling you the electricity. They don't make money on the energy itself. They don't care where you buy it, and they are, in fact, the energy that most of us get from ComEd or from Ameren or any of the others is purchased in the wholesale market by those companies through plans that are designed by the Illinois Power Agency. If we set up, when I was in the governor's office many years ago, there was in 07 an act of the legislature passed, what is that, 17 years ago, to set up the Illinois Power Agency, which became the buyer, not really the buyer, but the designer of the competitive bidding process, that by which the big utilities would purchase the energy which most consumers use. You can still buy it if you want from an unregulated third-party provider, but buyer beware. It's very hard to beat the price. In fact, it's impossible to beat the price of a huge buyer operating in a truly competitive way to acquire the energy you need. So the Illinois Power Agency was set up to do that, and it's been very effective in doing that. And the IPA also buys all the renewable energy, because we have a growing percentage every year of wind and solar in the mix, and that is done through this state agency as well.
Hmm. Yeah, it's I was at CUB by the time all of that was happening. When I first started, we were still in the middle of a 10-year rate freeze that was negotiated during the whole restructuring process. And so part of that was the electric utilities would freeze their rates for 10 years. And so when I came in, it was, at least from a kind of consumer education standpoint, it was kind of a boring time. In a way, it was terrible, because there weren't any kinds of programs other than low-income energy assistance for the lowest income of customers. But if someone called, because my first job at CUB was on the hotline, someone called and said my power bill is too high, there wasn't much to say other than, well, just try to use less. Now, of course, there's just been a boom in all kinds of, and this is the result of a series of laws that were passed in the state, introducing energy efficiency standards, renewable standards, all that good stuff. And a lot of CUB's role nowadays is helping consumers wade through all of those options there. But and I love, I love talking to you, Marty, because there's such a story here. And I think I feel like in this realm, especially, you can't really understand where we're at and how things are now fully without understanding the history of how they got that way. Because it's every state, and I get to, now that I'm ED, I get to travel around more and talk to people in similar roles in other states. And every state is different, and it's so fascinating to dig down and figure out why we're different and how we came to our different solutions across the states.
It's very different in each state.
We've been talking for a while now, and I'll probably have to let you go soon, but I don't want to let you go without hearing the story of how you left CUB and under what circumstances, because I think that is just a classic of American utility consumer advocacy. I was at CUB when I found out that you were going to be leaving as executive director in 2005.
Right.
Why did you leave us?
Well, in September of '05, early September, I got a call from the governor. Well, actually, the governor's chief of staff asking me if I would accept appointment to be chairman of the Illinois Commerce Commission. Well, that was a dream job for me, really. I'd always been on the advocacy side, and after 20 plus years of that, I thought, great, we're gonna, put me in as a head regulator. I'll take the heat, and we'll do the right thing. So I eagerly accepted that, probably maybe a little too hastily without thinking through the implications. But it was a Democratic governor. It was an election year. I was a very popular appointment. I knew my stuff, and I was committed to being absolutely even-handed and fair. And I had good relationships with the utility companies after all the years at CUB, and with legislators and with other regulators. I thought it was going to be pretty great. But I needed to be confirmed by the state Senate. And the way it works in Illinois is when you're appointed to the Commerce Commission, you begin serving immediately. So I was appointed, and then I left CUB in a few frantic days. And Dave Collada ended up replacing me at CUB, which was what I had hoped, and certainly had worked for. So CUB was in good shape, and I went to be chairman of the commission, and I began to do my job. I think the people at the commission were pretty happy to have me there. It seemed everything was going well, and then I heard that the Senate president, who was not exactly a friend of the governor at the time, was on the warpath. And that he had not been informed of my appointment ahead of time, and was pretty angry about that. And of course, there were some utility companies, for the most part, but some who didn't really want to see me as chairman of the Commerce Commission for obvious reasons, with my background as a consumer advocate. And I heard that the Senate president had not been informed of my appointment. And I went to the governor and I said, Rod, Emil, who was the Senate president, as he was known, is so angry because, you didn't tell him about my appointment. And the governor said, yeah, if I would have told him, he would have said, don't do it. And I was like, oh boy, I am in trouble. And I am pretty naive. And I no regrets. I served for 7 weeks, and then I lost by my confirmation hearing by a single vote. But a single vote might have been 1,000 votes. Mm-hmm. It was a structured roll call, bipartisan support and opposition. I needed 30 votes, and I had 15 Democrats and 14 Republicans. I had 29 votes. And with that, after 7 weeks, I was dismissed. The only person in the history of Illinois to be denied the chairmanship.
Such an honor. Such an honor.
Yes. So that was a blow. And I have to acknowledge it was partially my fault for having allowed myself to be misled. And I was basically, in a bad spot politically, so to speak, and never really had a chance. And it became kind of ugly, and it was unfortunate. But then I went to work in the governor's office, and that was the time just before and I worked on the Illinois Power Agency Act in '07, and then I worked on getting that agency on its feet when it began at the end of '07, first of '08, and then I saw the handwriting on the wall. I didn't like, and the governor was, I don't want to make it too personal here, but I didn't think that, I put it this way, when I was appointed, nobody had any idea that the governor was corrupt, and he was reelected another time after that, and nobody had any idea. And it was only after I left, a year after I left, that it came to light that the governor was in legal trouble. And the rest is history. But I'm I did some good work on the commission for 7 glorious brief weeks, and then I worked helping on energy and other policy issues, many policy issues in the governor's office for a couple of years before I became a consultant. And I'm only recently retired from my consulting business. I still do a little, keep my hand in it. And I worked in my post-CUB and post-government years for a number of different clients, including consumer advocacy groups like CUB and public utilities like ComEd. I've worked on, you might say, both sides, but I have no. I'm glad to have helped ComEd become a more customer-friendly company, and I think they are today than they were, much more so than they were a long time ago. That's another story to talk about, but not today. In any case, I keep my hand in it a little bit now and follow the issues, but mostly I pursue my hobbies. I'm back to being a potter, which is where I started.
Excellent.
Years ago.
You got to have your hobbies. I agree, even if they're dangerous ones that might result in hurting your finger.
Yeah.
It's such a great Illinois story. I just love it, and I know I tell you this a lot, but especially when I was head of outreach at CUB, going out into the field and traveling around and giving presentations to people, I was always having people come up to me asking me about you, Marty. CUB members over the years, like whatever happened to Marty Cohen? What's he up to? And, I was like, he's still around. He's still around.
Remarkably, he's still around.
Yeah, he pops into our office. I think we might still have one of your suit jackets, hanging up on a back of a door there. He's still around. I think you're helping out CUB Ohio.
Yes, I'm working with CUB Ohio. I work on a lot of electric vehicle issues. Mm-hmm. I'm a big proponent of electric vehicles, and I've done a lot of writing on those issues for CUB in Ohio and in Illinois and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So I keep a little bit active in the biz.
Yeah, good. Well, so here you go, everybody. Reassurance that Marty is still around and he's still keeping active. But I congratulate you on your retirement. Jealous, maybe one day. But
you'll get there.
It's just a pleasure. Thank you so much for making the time to do this with us. I hope maybe we can have you back. I got to talk to Sue Stewart in one of these a couple months ago, which was really
great. I didn't watch that one. I will look it up.
Go back and watch that. Yeah, it was super talking to her. So it's just I feel so lucky to be part of an organization with such a awesome history, and to get to go to work and be a good guy every day. And so thanks, Marty. It's been real. And thanks everybody for tuning in. This will live on in the ether.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Marty.
Work.
For sure.